You may have heard that the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution is actually the most important amendment because it is a right that protects all of the other rights. So that's one idea that is very worthy of attention and further explanation. The second thing you may have heard about the Second Amendment is that it's not actually a right given by the Constitution, but it's actually speaking of a God given right. So, in this talk, I want to explain further these 2 points and explain why both of these points are actually completely correct and why not understanding these points is why most people disregard the Second Amendment or think various erroneous things about it and don't realize how important it really is. So I'll begin with the idea that the right to keep and bear arms, which is what the Second Amendment says, is in fact the right that defends the other rights that are listed in the Bill of Rights. And you could also include like the Declaration on Human Rights, various documents talking about the rights and liberties of humanity. Why is the right to keep and bear arms actually fundamental or a prerequisite to all those other rights? So I will do my best to briefly explain that here. In order to understand why the Second Amendment, or the right to keep and bear arms, is actually the most fundamental right, you have to understand the fundamental dynamic at play concerning natural law or natural rights. And even before I clarify that again, as I did in previous talks, let's first just clarify what that means, the right to keep and bear arms. So that's language that's, I guess you could say, a little antiquated, it's from some time ago. It's not exactly how we speak today. So to make it more clear, the modern English equivalent would be the right to own and carry weaponry. That is an equivalent statement. The right to keep and bear arms, the keeping, speaking of ownership, and the bearing is speaking of carrying with you on your person, in your vehicle, wherever. So it's the right to own and carry weaponry. Arms is equivalent to weaponry. So the right to own and carry weapons. Why is this actually the most fundamental and important right? Well, the reason is because all of the rights listed in the Bill of Rights are actually all speaking against various forms of abuse, right? Let's take your right to freely practice your religion. If you didn't have that right, what would that mean? It would mean that someone was being abusive toward you in the manner of restricting your right, restricting your ability to practice your religion. So let's get real everyday reality here. What would that look like? Well, you could just look at what goes on in North Korea and China elsewhere, and you could see what the government does there. And it's pretty straightforward. If some people try to gather together and practice the religion, meaning like read scripture and pray together and, have a gathering in a religious context, the state, in other words, government employees, people working for the government, would come to that group of people and threaten them with violence using weapons to break up that activity, right? If they're in a church of some kind, or, or just someone's house or wherever, just out in the park, people with weapons would come and, start pushing people around, maybe handcuffing them, throwing them in vehicles, putting them in jail, right? Being violent towards them, backed with weaponry, right? So the reason why the right to own and carry weaponry is the most important right is because abusers oftentimes use weapons to enforce their abuse, right? So if you don't have access to a weapon to defend yourself, then you don't really have any rights that can be upheld. Now, I'm sure if anyone, which is unfortunately a lot of people, has basically a socialist indoctrinated mindset, they might immediately be like raising their eyebrows, like, what are you talking about? The government protects our rights, they don't violate them. Again, you apparently like have ignored all of political history as if like that is irrelevant, and you also ignore like all of the violations occurring currently around the world as if those don't exist. So it's really a pretty amazing delusional mindset, but it's one fostered by the mass media, right? Because the mass media only presents this delusional mindset as like the correct view. And so it seems like, oh, well, this must be the truth because this is what I'm shown on my TV screen. This is what I'm taught at school. But it's actually completely detached from reality. But rather getting lost in current events and history, let's just return to basic logic here and basic ethics and a basic understanding of why the ability to defend yourself from abuse is actually the most fundamental human right. Again, that is because all natural rights are fundamentally rights against abuse. It's all just versions of abuse that are being rejected, right? The right to free speech is rejecting the abuse of someone restricting your ability to speak freely. The right to practice your religion is a rejection of the abuse of someone abusively controlling you by restricting your ability to practice your religion, right? The right to assemble with others is a rejection of the abuse of someone telling you, hey, you can't, gather with people. Again, it's just another form of abusive control. Natural rights, fundamentally, it's just the right to not be abused. And then you just have variations on the abuse, and then those are called various natural rights or various human rights. It's all just the right to not be abused. So that's the key thing to understand. All natural law is fundamentally is the right to not be abused. Natural law is a law of comprehensive love. It's what Jesus told us is the whole and complete law, what he called the greatest commandments. And that befriending love is an action, and its opposite action is abuse. So it's a law against abuse. It is that simple. The moral law of this universe is that simple. But the work of deceptive abusers is to make you think that there are exceptions to that rule, that either what they're doing isn't really abuse, or if it is abuse, it's okay when they do it. And both of those ideas are false. So, this is why actually the Second Amendment is a representation of God's supreme law. Because, again, if you don't have the ability to defend yourself from abuse, and all rights are fundamentally against abuse, you see how the right or the ability to defend yourself from abuse is fundamental? Again, if someone wants to practice the religion, maybe on a piece of paper it says, oh, you have the right to practice your religion, but every time they try and do so, some crazy authoritarian comes around with a weapon and prevents them from having their congregation, prevents them from having, their time where they're praying and singing and praising God, right? Like imagine there just repeatedly was this, let's make it super simple. Imagine there's just this one crazy authoritarian, right? With a weapon, with a sword. And you have a group of people that keep trying to gather to sing and pray together. But this guy with the sword keeps coming by and, starts swinging the sword and hurt, and if they don't run away, he'll actually, you know, cut them and hurt them. And this just happens over and over. They keep gathering and then the guy keeps coming back, but because they don't have swords themselves, they can't do anything. You might say, oh, well, if it was that scenario, actually, they could do something, because they greatly outnumber him. I understand, like, we could go off on that, like, tactical tangent there, but for the sake of this argument, I think you can get what I'm saying here, which is that if someone has use of a weapon and another person or a small group of people don't have access to that weapon, then the person with the weapon has the advantage, right? That's just like common sense. And we see this oftentimes played out, for example, in gun-free zones, right? Where the ethical, to call it an ethical blunder is just to be overly kind. I mean, it's just not even close to the truth. They know that it's making people defenseless and opening them up to victimization, but they'd rather have a disarmed population than a truly safe population. But my point here being that if you establish a so-called, or what they actually call a gun-free zone, I say so-called because criminals don't listen to, don't pay attention to the signs and they come with the gun anyway. So so-called gun-free. If you have a situation like that, right, it is like I was describing with the, you know, congregation scenario where people are just basically running for their lives because they don't have a weapon of equal power to neutralize the attack, right? But when there has been someone with a firearm, they've been able to end the violence, right? They've been able to use defensive force, stop the shooter and end, the massacre. So this is so basic. And yet this basic understanding, this basic perspective is lost because mainstream society is just permeated with propaganda that supports abusive control, supports socialism slash communism, and you know, again tries to deceive people into thinking that having the ability to defend yourself and those around you is a bad thing. But this goes deep. This goes like metaphysical, religious deep, because it really is God's supreme law. So let me try and make that more clear. Again, the fundamental law of creation for humanity is, like I said, the law of love. And the opposite of that befriending, loving action is abuse. Right? If you look up the antonym to befriending someone, it's abusing someone. So when Jesus said the law is comprehensive love, that's simultaneously a law against its opposite. That's basic law of logic there. So fundamental law is a law against abuse. You may have heard of the non-aggression principle, and that coincides with this law against abuse, or the non-abuse principle. It's only 1/3 of it, though, because aggression is actually just one of 3 forms of abuse. The other 2 forms are theft and deception. So aggression, theft, and deception are 3 forms of abuse. And that's what the powers that be take part in on a daily basis, by the way. So if you don't have the right to stop abuse, can you carry out God's law? So to make this clear, think about if someone was trying to hurt someone you care about, a family member or a child, and you were there, what would you do? Well, you would most likely intervene to stop the violence towards the person that you care about, right? So you would be exercising that befriending love, that action of love, in order to defend that other person, right? So if it was just someone, using their bare hands, you would probably stand a good chance of, being able to stop them also using your bare hands. But say they had a weapon. Well, now your chances of being able to defend the person you care about are much less if you don't also have a weapon. All right, this is just basic tactical common sense, or I guess you could call it, like martial arts 101. Martial arts can include weaponry, by the way, if you didn't know that. So if you can't defend someone you care about because the person being violent towards them has a weapon and you don't have that weapon, you're then being restricted in your ability to carry out God's law, right? Again, because God's law is a law of love. And if you're defending someone from abuse, that's a form of love. I'm going to repeat this because I think people, it's so easy to like miss this point or just gloss over it or think I'm getting theoretical. But this is like so crucial to understand, because once you understand this, it's like you see through all the propaganda, and it's just you finally get to the fundamental truth of good and evil. If you can't defend someone you care about, then you're not able to exercise loving action toward them. It's the same for yourself. If you can't defend yourself, well, then you can't actually be loving toward yourself, because it is loving to stop abuse, right? If you don't see that, just think, I don't know why you wouldn't see that, but just really get that point. Stopping abuse is an act of love. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here. Using defensive force to stop abuse is an act of love, and comprehensive love is God's eternal law. That is the moral law for creation. So that's point 1. Defensive force against abuse is an act of love. You could say it's point 1. Point 2 is loving action is God's law. So then conclusion, point 3, being able to defend yourself and others against abuse is carrying out God's law. So I hope I spelled out that logical sequence there well enough. So, what does this have to do with the Second Amendment? Everything, because the right to own and carry weaponry is enabling you to defend yourself and defend others from people that are being violent using weaponry, right? The right to keep and bear arms, again, remember, means weaponry, is the right to be able to defend yourself and others from violence being carried out by people with weapons, right? So a lot of people, that are indoctrinated and just in this foolish socialist perspective think like anyone who is pro Second Amendment is just like a gun nut, is the slander they'll like to put forth. But this is just extremely dumb. It's really dumb because it ignores the fact that abusive people oftentimes use weaponry, right? So you don't need to be a so-called gun nut to recognize, well, if abusive people have guns and everyone else doesn't, what's to stop the abusive people from running amok and just abusing people left and right? Again, like we can observe in gun-free zone, that previous logic sequence that I was expressing, right? The reason why the Second Amendment is the most fundamental right is because, number one, all rights are speaking against various forms of abuse. But since abusers use weaponry to back up their abuse, if you don't have access to weaponry yourself, then you can't stop the abuse adequately, right? In most cases, you need to have something of equal or greater force in order to adequately defend yourself or to defend others, right? That's just common sense, right? Like I said, otherwise you just have people running for their lives rather than being able to use defensive force and neutralize and end the violence that has commenced, right? And again, the fundamental moral law is a law of love. The opposite of that is abuse. And so it's a law against abuse. But if you can't actually stop the abuse, then you can't carry out the moral law. And the way that the powers that be operate is, again, to just try and convince people over and over that there's an exception to that rule, that it's not actually abuse when they undermine your right to defend yourself. It's actually caretaking, right? And this is why people say, like, all gun laws are in infringement or all gun laws are unconstitutional. And the reason why that's factual, the reason why that's hitting on a deep truth, is because there already is law against violence, right? Again, that's just like natural law and a common sense. If someone's being violent, if someone's, going around hurting people, it's already established that that person should be stopped. So what are the gun laws about, right? The gun laws are not about just repeating that previous known law that, like violence and murder is not okay. It's actually about restricting the access to weaponry by nonviolent people. And, you see this in various forms, especially in recent years, like where they'll talk about, oh, you can't have magazine capacity, greater than 8 rounds or 10 rounds. Or they'll say, oh, you can't own body armor, right? So they're saying that this is in the interest of public safety to supposedly stop violence, but really it's just an act of abuse that is making people more defenseless so that they can't actually carry out God's law of love. They can't actually defend themselves or others. And people just keep getting bamboozled over and over again because the fundamental socialist communist perspective is that, again, preemptive attack is okay. It's okay for them to commit violence first in the name of safety, and the people carrying out this preemptive attack are a superior subclass of humanity. Again, both false statements, which are the pillars of a totalitarian dystopia police state, which emerges more and more as those two false perspectives are allowed to operate as the basis for society and policy. A lot of people have been duped into thinking that basically it'd be better to live in a socialist police state than in the so-called Wild West or in a state of nature or state of anarchy. And they think that they're so wise for holding that perspective. But that so-called wisdom, again, is based on two fundamental blunders, two fundamental ignorant false views, which are, again, that whoever is deemed the authority is in fact a superior subclass of humanity who deserves the special right to do abusive things that other people, normal people, so-called regular people, don't have the right to do. And that, again, too, it's okay to be violent towards others first if you say it's to prevent possible future violence, right? That's the basis of their whole morally bankrupt view. That's why socialism, that's why communism is a continuous disaster, is because it's based on falsehood and it's based on a completely backwards morality. And a lot of socialist-minded people will say, well, look where, these other places are that, the people were disarmed and only the government has access to legal weaponry. They seem to be doing pretty well. Well, not really. Look how quickly a so-called, like civilized place like Australia can turn into a draconian police state overnight, basically, because all the government has to do is declare some kind of emergency, again, in the name of safety, and then they start abusing people to an extreme, pushing injections on them, beating them up in the street, kidnapping them from their homes, like full-on police state. And how did that come to be? Well, it started with the disarming of the Australian people. That's the prerequisite. And so you might be in the post-disarm, the immediate post-disarmament period where you're like, oh, everything's great now, until, the lockdown comes, right? Until the police state comes in. And then you're like, sure would be nice if we could keep these, socialist control freaks in check, but we can't actually do that because they have all the weapons and we don't. So you get, the Second Amendment becomes clear to the socialists when they're, being sent off to the concentration camp, basically. But not until then. And they're like, oh, maybe it would be good if we also had access to weapons so that if these people in government become abusive, we could actually defend ourselves. It's like, yeah, that's what folks were trying to tell you, decades prior, and you made them out to be, so-called gun nuts and extremists and whatever. Those are the people you slandered, and now you realize that they were speaking perfect sense, actually. Why would you think that people in positions of power never use weapons in a violent way, in a bad way. Like, how could you be a human being on the planet Earth and hold that view? It's completely delusional. It's obviously disconnected from all of history, but also current reality. It's not like people in positions of power were only abusive with weaponry in the past, and we're now in some future society where that doesn't occur. It still occurs on a daily basis. So the view that it's a good idea for people in positions of power, for governments to have all the weapons, like, I understand that that might seem like the way to go, but again, the only reason it seems that way to you is because you're brainwashed, is because you pay attention to mainstream news and state education that is continually deceiving you into thinking that, again, point one, false belief number one, that people in government are a superior subclass of humanity, and two, that they have the right to commit preemptive attack. One form of that being disarming nonviolent people, another form of that being pushing pharmaceutical cocktails and medical devices on people in the name of safety, right? Medical tyranny and disarming nonviolent people and restricting, access to weaponry for defensive use, by nonviolent people are the two greatest acts of tyranny that have been occurring in recent years. And yet, especially younger generation, they're completely duped, think they're wise, and they'll just make fun of anyone speaking against medical tyranny, and speaking against violations of the Second Amendment. Like, I just came across a comedy video where they were, making this like stereotypical kind of conservative freedom lover who was like uh, next to someone in a hospital bed who was dying, and he refused to wear the mask, and so they were making him out to be like this heartless, delusional, guy who just cared only about freedom, even if it was harming someone else, right? And so they think it's that cut and dry. They think, oh well, if the government says, first of all, that some crisis is occurring, well, it certainly must be. Everything they say about it must be 100% true. No chance that they're lying. No chance that it's an act of state sponsored terrorism. No chance that they're involved in any way, shape, or form. They're saints walking upon the earth. Everything they say is true. And not only that, not only can we completely trust anything they say about a crisis, we can then also give our complete trust that whatever they say is the solution is the perfect solution. Whatever thing they say to inject, they say inject this mystery concoction into your body and your children's body. Oh, it must be perfectly fine because they're the authorities. It's just appeal to authority to an extreme. It's just idiotic idol worship. And yet they think they're wise. They think they're reasonable. Being an idol worshiper of the most abusive people in the world, currently and historically, is not intelligent. You're not wise. And yet they smugly think they are. There's even the term useful idiots. That's what they are. They've been indoctrinated to be pawns of the state. And they're so indoctrinated that they actually think that they're, at the front line of establishing social justice and the front line of like true science and true rationality, when they're actually just pushing aggressive communist bullshit on the whole population. So I just want to finish with an idea and a question. And that's concerning law and order. So, what is law and order really? You may have heard, if again you happen to escape the bubble of mainstream narrative, mainstream news media and commentary and entertainment and all that. You may have heard the phrase, the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So I would agree with that. And I would also say that that's actually hitting on what law and order really is fundamentally. So, first of all, what is the law? Well, the only law that is completely true and completely correct is God's law, which again, Jesus told us is a law of comprehensive love, to love God, love others, and love yourself. He said all of the law and all of the teachings of the prophets are distilled into that, distilled into those greatest commandments. And that's 100% true. If you don't realize it's 100% true, you're just not paying attention, because it really is the moral law written into the fabric of creation. So that's the true law part of law and order. But what about the order part? Okay, so we have this great law, we have this perfect law that we were given, but how do we maintain order? Or in other words, how do we enforce that law? Well, you would need to be able to employ defensive force, right? Again, the perfect law is a law of love against abuse. So in order to enforce a law against abuse, you need to be able to defend against abuse. And if the abuser is using a weapon, then you would also need access to a weapon in order to adequately defend against that abuse. And here's that simple logic sequence that is nowhere to be found in mainstream society, right? Mainstream news, mainstream commentary. So I would argue that that's true law and order. And you might say, well, it's not real law and order, even though we have, the greatest commandments written on paper. We have it actually written in the most widely published book in the world, known as the Bible, right? Known as the New Testament, right? The greatest commandments are readily available for anyone and everyone to read, right? Go to the New Testament in the book of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. In the book of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. And then in the book of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 28. That's where you find Jesus speaking of the greatest commandments, right? Each of those passages are giving the same message. They're just different testimonies on that teaching of Jesus. So if that is the perfect law, even if you're not religious, you might agree that, say you're just an ethics professor or something like that. You might agree, well, yeah, that makes sense. That befriending love should be considered the highest, moral action, and that the opposite of that befriending love, which is abuse, should be considered, the fundamental unethical action. You don't need to be a believer to recognize the truth of that, the rationality of that. So why is that not considered the real law, right? Why is it whatever law politicians come up with is considered the real law, even though it can violate that law, which is the true law? Law and order, when that phrase is oftentimes used, it's talking about state law, and it's talking about state enforcement of the law using state employees with weapons, right? But why is that true law and order? Is that true law and order? So that's a question to contemplate. And why would you think that these people, who are again supposedly a superior subclass of humanity, can actually make a better law which violates the law against abuse, that has these supposed exceptions, like it's okay for us to restrict access to weaponry for defensive use, even though if you were to, just disarm your neighbor, that would clearly be abusive, it would clearly be wrong. Or if you were to push drug cocktails on your neighbor and your neighbor's children, that would clearly be wrong and abusive. Why do you think, again, that it's not abuse when these so-called authority figures do it? Again, it's because you would have to perceive them as a superior subclass, but that's even itself internally inconsistent. It's a contradiction in and of itself, because you're assuming people that carry out actions which are normally perceived of as abusive, you're perceiving those abusive people as superior. So that makes no sense at all. Why would you first of all think of a subclass of humanity as superior? Well, quick answer is because you were indoctrinated to see them as such, and they're presented to you as such. But then why don't you perceive that it's impossible for them to be superior if what they're doing is clearly inferior to common sense ethics and is clearly against the perfect law of love? All right, I hope you found some of this insightful, and I hope that this made more clear why the Second Amendment is of the utmost importance, and the ability to use defensive force adequately is the most fundamental human right, because if you don't have the ability to defend yourself and others from abuse, well, then there is no real social justice. There really is no human rights for humanity, because those rights can just be violated at any time. And a couple of final points. Firstly, on having to do with weapon type. This should be obvious from what I said previously, but just in case it's not. In order to defend yourself against someone who has a weapon that they're using in a violent manner, like I said, you need to have a weapon of equal or greater power, right? If someone has a sword and you only have a stick, you're likely to lose that fight. Likewise, if someone has a rifle with a magazine capacity of, say, 50 rounds, and you only have a pistol with 8 rounds, you're at a disadvantage and you're not capable of defending yourself and those around you adequately, usually, right? In most scenarios. I'm not saying it's impossible, but there is basic logic again to the idea that in most cases you would need a weapon of equal power and capacity to defend yourself, against that type of weapon. So when politicians are talking about, oh, well, you have no need for this particular kind of rifle because that's only used for military operations or what have you, or that's only used for aggressive action. Well, that's just a lie. And also, it's just assuming that they who do have those firearms will never use them unethically. So, again, it's that assumption of superiority, which is completely detached from reality. But also, it just disregards common scenarios where you can have one person being victimized by multiple attackers. So they're going to need more ammunition to deal with multiple attackers than they would if they were only dealing with one. Or who's to say that military equipment couldn't be misused? And in that case, having something like a rifle with a high magazine capacity is going to better serve you for defensive purposes than if you were restricted to, say, just a pistol with, an 8-round magazine. So all of the gun laws that are trying to make out certain weapons or certain braces or, like I said, body armor, any restriction on weaponry like that in the name of safety is abusive and based on the false premise of preemptive attack being legitimate, and that those that do have the superior firearms are ethically superior people. It's not complicated. Again, I mentioned the non-aggression principle being one part of the non-abuse principle. If someone isn't actually committing violence, you don't have the right to commit violence against them. Preemptive attack is not legitimate. You can't disarm someone or limit their ability to use defensive force because you say, well, the weapons that they're holding for defensive use, they might use for aggressive use. So I'm going to commit aggression against them first by restricting their access to that weaponry. That's not legitimate. Again, the only reason you would think that that's legitimate is because you say, oh, well, the people doing that restriction, the people enforcing that restriction are a superior subclass of humanity. And so therefore, they have the right to do abusive things like restrict people's ability to defend themselves adequately. These are false bunk ideas. Your perspective, your philosophy on society and safety is based on falsehood and has no sound ethical basis. And the final point I want to make is just about when people talk about America and they talk about, you know, why America is such an exceptional place, and that reason is that people have more freedom here. Well, again, that freedom exists for the most part because of the Second Amendment. That is what has upheld all of the other freedoms. And as these communist minded politicians and powers that be keep chipping away at the Second Amendment, keep making more and more infringements on your ability to defend yourself with weaponry, the country becomes less and less free and it becomes less and less exceptional. And it's just going to become yet another socialist police state, which can transform into a complete dystopia, draconian nightmare overnight at any time, because the assumption that those with all the weapons in the state are superior and would never misuse them, again, based on nothing true or rational, is the false belief in operation. So, yeah, the final 2 points here, again, just being that people saying things like, oh, well, the Second Amendment was just talking about muskets and, oh, you don't need these so-called assault weapons. Like, that is ridiculous. Like, again, you're just ignoring basic common sense, which is that you need to have adequate weaponry to defend against that same weaponry, right? Like, you need to have weaponry of equal force in order to defend yourself properly. That's just a basic understanding of, martial arts or warfare, however you want to put it. And secondly, what has made the United States exceptional is actually the Second Amendment. And as that fundamental right against abuse is chipped away at, is restricted more and more, the country just becomes more communist and a shittier place, less exceptional, and just becomes more part of this, global new world order for, basically communist control freaks to run, and everyone becomes their livestock. All right, thanks again for listening.